my name is Ken Gagney. I am on Twitter as Gamebits, which is also the name of my YouTube channel. And a year ago, last month, I came to Boston Indies and did a lightning talk about how I was expanding my YouTube channel, which consists of Let's Plays and unboxing videos, to include a new video series called IndieSider. It's a sort of a combination of a Let's Play and an audio podcast where I interview game developers. So I speak with developers of indie games while I'm playing their game. So you get to see the game while I'm talking with the people who created it. And so it now having been live for a year, I would like to talk about what I've learned in the past year, because there are two main audiences for IndieSider. There's indie developers who love coming on the show and plugging their new games, and there's gamers who love watching the show and discovering new indie games. But I need to improve my messaging because there's a third audience that I think is overlooking this show, which is other indie developers listening to the show and learning about how indie games are being made by other developers. Like, what tools are they using? What challenges do they face? What are they learning? And so from speaking with 30 different indie game developers in the past year, these are 5 trends that I've noticed. Now, this may be anecdotal. Your experience may be different. And also, I'm not an indie game developer, so I'm not talking about what I know. I'm talking about what other people are telling me. So if you disagree with me, it's not my fault. So 5 things I've learned. First of all, lesson number 1, you have to make several failed games before you make a successful game. And at first I thought that just meant it's sort of a lottery. You put 10 games out there, and if you're lucky, one of them will win. But that's not exactly what it means. You're not just playing a numbers game, because one of those so-called failed games may actually be the seeds for a successful game. I want to give you some examples. Super Happy Fun Block was at Boston Fig just 2 weeks ago. This is the subject of this week's IndieSider, going live, next Wednesday. And I asked him, how long have you been working on this game? And he said, 8 years. I'm like, what? What took you 8 years? It's like, well, I didn't actually work on it for 8 years. I was an undergrad, and I went to a game jam, and my friends and I came up with this idea for a game. And we thought it was really cool, but we didn't really know enough to develop it, and we didn't have the time or the funding to pursue it. So we went our own ways, and I worked at Zynga for a long time. But every now and then, in the back of my mind, I was like, I bet that would have been a really cool game. And finally, he quit Zynga to do his own thing and finally developed it into a full-fledged game. Similarly, this is Cthulhu Saves the World, a RPG for the Xbox 360 made by Zeboyd Games. And it proved to be really popular. He had done some other adventure RPGs, and he eventually got the contract to do the Penny Arcade on the Rain-Slick Precipice of Darkness games from the success of Cthulhu Saves the World. The way he started was with choose-your-own-adventure games. This is the same company. He made a game called Molly the Were-Zompire. It's a combination werewolf, zombie, vampire, and it was a choose-your-own-adventure game. And it was not successful. He sold maybe like a few hundred copies on Xbox 360. But from that, he learned how to roughly create a game, compile it, how to distribute it via Xbox, and learn the Xbox development tools. So that was an awesome learning experience. And he went right from that into RPGs and was very successful at it. So you never know what lesson you might learn and how those games might come back. For example, this is the Penny Arcade game on the Rain-Slick Precipice of Darkness. Here the heroes are fighting a creature called Molly the Were-Zompire. So it all comes back. Lesson number 2. A delayed game is forever good, but a rushed game is forever bad. Who said it? Me just now. No. That's right, Shigeru Miyamoto. Not exactly an indie developer, but that lesson is infinitely true for indie games. Again, I'll give you 2 examples. High Strangeness was at Boston Fig 2 years ago. It was the first ever funded video game on Kickstarter. Like way back in 2007, like, oh, what's this new Kickstarter thing? I guess I'll give that a try. And he went online and he got funding, and eventually the game came out for the Wii U. It took him that long to make the game because he wanted to get it just right. There was no sense rushing it. It came out for the Wii U, which didn't even exist when Kickstarter was founded. So he was making a game for a system that didn't even exist yet. But he was waiting for the right moment to release just the right game. Another example is Gathering Sky, which was at Boston Fig 2 years ago. And it just came out last month. And it was ready to launch about a year ago. They brought it to, I think it was GDC, showed it off. And a musician named Dren McDonald came up to them and said, your game is great, but it really needs a good soundtrack. The music you have in there right now isn't really doing the game justice. I will make a soundtrack for you. And the developer said, wow, that'd be amazing. And that postponed the release of the game for like a year because Dren McDonald had to get access to the San Francisco Conservatory where he works and get together a string orchestra and record the soundtrack. And when the game came out, it's amazing. The soundtrack is so beautiful. The way it just blends with the gameplay as you go from scene to scene. It really elevates the game a whole nother level. And they could have released it a year ago and beaten everybody else to the punch of a bird flying simulator game, I guess. But what's the rush? Wait until you get it just right. Lesson number 3. And this one can be kind of a downer. What your game is worth is not necessarily what people will pay. So you've worked for years on this game. You've gotten funding for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. You've worked with teams and developers and contractors. And now you're going to release it for like 99 cents on iOS because that's what people are used to paying. But there is an exception. If you have a niche audience, and one of the developers I interviewed on my show is Wade Clark, who made this text-adventure game, interactive fiction, called Lead Light Gamma. It is an Inform port of a game that was released for the Apple II 5 years ago in 2010. And he released it for $4.99. $4.99 for a text-adventure game. Is a text-adventure game worth $4.99? Absolutely. If you've ever spent even 5 minutes playing or designing a text-adventure game, you know that these things are amazing. And he worked really hard on it. And it's worth $4.99 because he may not necessarily be competing with people who are spending 99 cents on iOS to get a game that will last them 5 minutes to an hour or whatever. But people who are going to buy a text-adventure game, who even know what a text-adventure is, are probably going to buy the game no matter what he put the price at. So in that case, he can actually charge what the game is worth, at least, because he knows his audience will pay that much. Lesson number 4. Release on mobile last. This is a lesson I heard a lot. So if you release a game on Steam and you charge $4.99 and then later on you port it to mobile and you charge $1.99 for it, people are going to be thrilled. They get a smaller, more portable version of your game for a smaller amount of money. Awesome. But let's say that you release it on iOS first, and then you decide to make it a bigger and better game, release it for more platforms, more features, etc., and you release it on Steam for $4.99, people are going to be pissed off. Because they're like, wait, you're doubling the price for the same game, even if it isn't. They're not going to look closely enough to find out that you did all this extra work, and that porting from iOS to Steam or Xbox or Amazon Fire TV was really hard and required you to recompile all the code and write it from scratch and from the ground up. They don't care. All they see is that it's the same game, and they're not going to pay more for the same game. They will pay less, but not more. So think about what order in which you want to release these products. You can even release them at the same time for different prices, and that's fine. But going from mobile and then to a larger platform, not necessarily the best idea. And my 5th and final lesson, and this time I am speaking from personal experience, what I've learned about indie games is that I have no idea what it means to be indie. So when I said I was going to do a podcast about indie games, I needed to come up with a constraint, something that would limit my choices. So I decided, okay, to be indie means to be self-published. That's the definition I decided to use. I'll take credit for that, John. But I knew even then that this was problematic. This was just because I needed to have some sort of a definition. So self-published games, well, great. That includes The Counting Kingdom, and it includes Cat Lateral Damage. And you know what else self-published means? Mario Kart 8 and Resident Evil 6. Those were self-published. The company that made the game also published it. They got to retain their IP, just like Counting Kingdom and Cat Lateral Damage. So that doesn't necessarily work. So I've tried to keep to both the letter and the spirit of what it means to be indie, whatever that is. And I was really good at maintaining both the spirit and the letter up until just recently. So about 6 months ago, Michael there connected me with a gentleman named Sion Rosenblum in Melbourne, Australia, of company 3 Sprockets, who made a game called Fight the Dragon. Totally indie game. He came on my show. We had a great interview. 6 months later, he emails me and says, Ken, we just released our latest indie game, and we'd love if you would consider it for your podcast. I said, great. What game is that? Pac-Man 256. I'm like, how is that indie? It's one of the most iconic video game characters in more than 3 decades of the industry. published by one of the biggest game studios, Bandai Namco, in the world. How is that an indie? So I brought him on my show and asked him that. I said, Sion, Pac-Man, indie, seriously? You're pulling my leg, right? And he said, no, because the IP may not be his, but the entire game was developed by the same team that did Fight the Dragon. They didn't have any outside resources. They weren't handed a blueprint or a design schematic. They weren't told what this game was supposed to look like or act like. They had almost completely free reign to make whatever game they wanted and call it Pac-Man. And so, in his mind, and probably in mine as well, that is an indie game. It violates my self-published rule, but it's still an interesting perspective on what it means to be indie. So those are the 5 lessons I've learned, or at least in my first year of hosting the IndieSider podcast. Any questions? Cool. Thank you.